Hello, welcome to Learning with the Cleveland Orchestra. My name is Rose Breckenridge, and I'm lecturing today for the Cleveland Orchestra series, Music in Depth. Today we're looking at John Adams and his composition Shaker Loops. I'll be talking about John Adams's life and also his musical style. I'll give you background for Shaker Loops, plus a musical tour of the piece. Well, let's get started. John Adams was born in 1947 in New England. In Massachusetts, he was raised in Vermont and then New Hampshire. His family loved New England. Both his parents were jazz musicians. His father played the clarinet and was John's first teacher. John's talent and love for music led him eventually to study composition at Harvard University. He graduated in 1971 with a master's degree in composition. During his time at Harvard, young composers were often discouraged against writing tonal music because many American composers at the time, especially in East Coast academia, had embraced dissonant atonality and the serialism method of composition. Actually, that started after World War II and went on into the 50s and 60s and 1970s. But Adams was not convinced. When he finished his studies at Harvard, he was still finding his way, musically speaking. He decided he needed to leave the East Coast to do that. So he packed up his Volkswagen Beetle, rusting out I might add, and drove across the country to the West Coast. He had no job in hand. Once he arrived there in the San Francisco Bay Area, he actually worked at a warehouse driving a forklift truck before his career eventually took off, and it did. He was soon appointed in 1972 to the faculty of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, where he taught composition and conducted the conservatory's new music ensemble for 10 years. With that ensemble, he created new and innovative ways to write music, including in his early days using tape loops that were electronically manipulated with synthesizers. In 1978, he became the new music advisor to the San Francisco Symphony, and he helped to create the symphony's new and unusual music series, a series that emphasized in its concerts the performance of music written by living composers. Adams' desire to communicate with his audiences emotionally has brought him great success, both as a composer and as a conductor. His works are probably the most performed of any living American composer. And as a conductor, he's developed ongoing relationships with many important orchestras throughout the world, including the Cleveland Orchestra, where his works are often programmed and he visits to conduct. His operas have brought Adams to international attention, beginning with his Nixon in China from 1987. Adams believes that operatic characters are often mythical, but modern operas should not use the mythical gods that Wagner did in his Ring cycle. Rather, instead, he likes to use larger-than-life figures from our own time. And he does not shy away from political issues. Instead, he often embraces them. Especially controversial is his 1991 opera, The Death of Klinghoffer, which is about a retired, disabled Jewish-American passenger on an Italian cruise ship hijacked by terrorist Palestinians. It's actually based on a real event from 1985. His opera Dr. Atomic from 2005 is about J. Robert Oppenheimer and the creation and testing of the first atomic bomb back in 1945 at Los Alamos in New Mexico. The opera centers on the emotional struggles of the characters, both their internal struggles within themselves and also their external struggles with each other as they work feverishly to unleash the terrible power of the first atomic bomb. That opera was so successful that Adams actually took highlights from it and knit them together into a symphony of the same name. Well, what about his musical style? Adams started out as a 20th century minimalist. So that style is characterized by a return to tonality as a consonant ground of music, the use of reduced, hence the word minimal, musical materials, and many repetitive patterns that are filled with dynamic rhythmic energy, and putting them together in layers of sound that move at various and differing speeds. Plus, another characteristic is the blurred boundaries. The music seems to morph from one section to another without any clear seams. And that is challenging for many listeners. So we have to learn a, if you will, new way to listen, almost like we're on a journey on a train going across the country and watching the landscape slip by and change gradually from the coast, the East Coast, to the Appalachians, to the prairies of the Midwest, to the Rockies, to the West Coast. His 2002 work on the transmigration of souls, commemorating the victims of 9/11, brings together differing strands of his style to create a, if you will, memory space. Those are Adams' words. It uses orchestra, chorus, children's choir, along with recorded city sounds and also recorded readings of victims' names, missing person posters, New York Times portraits of grief. This composition is exceptionally moving, and it actually won the Pulitzer Prize for Music in 2003. So it demonstrates how Adams has, if you will, moved beyond just minimalism. In fact, he actually describes himself as a minimalist bored with minimalism. His works bring together the rhythmic energy of minimalism, but combine that with his love of both serious music, like late 19th century Romanticism, with its rich orchestral colors and harmonies, and his love of popular music, like jazz, ragtime, and rock. All of those popular styles filled with wonderful energy and vitality. So what's the background of Shaker loops? Well, it really marks Adams' shall we say, mature style in its very beginning form. When he was in San Francisco back in 1978, he had this idea of writing a piece for string quartet. He called it Wave Maker. His goal, he tells us, was to use oscillating melodic cells to, and I use his words, create a rippling, shimmering complex of patterns like the surface of an agitated pond or lake. And unfortunately, when that work premiered, again to use Adams' words, it crashed and burned. He later said that he thought his technique lagged behind his inspiration. So he withdrew that string quartet and created a new work based on the same ideas with more mature grasp of technique and better inspiration, at least in his thoughts. He wrote it first for string septet, 7 instruments, 3 violins, viola, 2 cellos, and 1 bass. And he called this piece Shaker Loops. It premiered at the end of 1978, and it proved quite successful. And it really went towards launching his career. Then he revisited it in 1983 and created a version of Shaker Loops for string orchestra. That's what we'll be looking at today. The title is actually a play on words. Adams loves puns, and many of his pieces use punning titles like The Century Rolls, In this instance, shaker has a double meaning, referring first to the shaking in the strings, oscillating back and forth. And remember, in earlier days of music, trills, which is the alternation of two adjacent notes, were called shakes, all right? So you have the shaking, the literal shaking of the strings in the music. It also refers to the practice of ecstatic dancing to lively music that the pious Shakers practiced in their worship services. Remember, Adams grew up in New England, and he actually lived for a time near the last Shaker community. The loops part of the title refers to the melodic and rhythmic figures that constantly repeat, like tape loops that are manipulated in electronic music. So in this composition, Shaker Loops, Adams found the beginning of his very unique style. He uses the gradual shiftings of minimalistic harmonic and rhythmic patterns that repeat throughout, and he creates a new kind of musical journey, one that makes us focus on the present moment because we don't know what to expect, and there doesn't seem to be clear boundaries or seams between the sections, and yet he shapes it with his love of other diverse styles of music into a drama that develops not only within each of the sections or movements, but also between the connected parts of the work. So let's do a musical tour. So the piece itself is in actually 4 movements. The first movement is entitled Shaking and Trembling and is fast. The second movement is called Hymning Slews. It's slow. The third movement is called Loops and Verses, and it starts out slow but then accelerates and morphs into the fourth movement, which he calls the final shaking, returning to a faster tempo as the first movement was. So with regard to this, you have to remember they're not discrete separate movements, but they morph gradually one into the other, so it's a continuous piece. And the title of the first section, Shaking and Trembling, refers to its manipulation of the musical materials. It uses repeating, energetic, rhythmic patterns that constantly change as they're superimposed on each other. And as we move into the piece, it also uses the shaking of trills to develop the drama. The movement starts in the divided strings, trembling as they do these repeated rhythmic patterns, very soft at first, playing over the fingerboard. We call that sol tasto. And very soon, as the music progresses, you're going to hear jabs that start to intrude. Now that's pretty soft. Gradually, the music's dynamic level begins to increase, and we're going to have the music not only growing, if you will, louder, but also the texture is going to increase and become thicker. Now this is getting even faster, and you'll notice that the range is rather low, but as the music increases in speed, it's also going to move the range up a little bit. Now, even as these very rapid patterns are repeating and growing and rising and falling in volume and pitch and range, in a moment we're going to hear a slow, low melodic line attempting to enter the texture. The upper figures work to crowd it out, but it creates an interesting moment. Here are the patterns, here it comes. A bit of a struggle develops between the low, slow points that are foreshadowing the next movement and the insistence of the upper figures not to lose out. Eventually, though, we do have a drop in the volume and everything begins to melt and fade away. It all drops down with those magical color drops in the high register. And the music melts literally into the second movement that's called hymning slews. Well, what does that mean? I mentioned already that this movement is slow. It's not only slow, it's quite languid. And the term slews is actually a term used in electronic music created with a synthesizer. And it refers to the use of sliding between two notes. In live music, we call that slide a glissando. Normally, it's over a range of a wider interval. Sometimes it's just the adjacent note, in which case it's more strictly called a portamento or a leaning slide. But before we hear all the slides, the music itself begins in a haze of peaceful chords that create the mysterious sense of time standing still, which is so wonderful, especially after the agitation of the first movement. And very soon we begin to hear those sliding glissandos enter the texture. And they echo throughout. They kind of float over these low, sustained pedals that we call held notes. Now a new quivering moves the music up to a new tonal level, even as the glissandos continue. It creates a serene and magical mood The music swells at several times as it moves higher and higher. He uses a lot of harmonics, we call them, where the string players are creating overtones by not pressing the string all the way down. The music gently floats and fades into the third movement, which he entitles Loops and Verses. And this actually has a sustained melodic idea at the very beginning. It comes in a solo cello. We're going to hear some gentle rocking figures. This long melody seems to go on eternally, soothing our souls, but then it's going to drop out. The pulsing begins to rise and fall, both in volume and pitch. The cello is going to re-enter, and this time playing a little louder and a little faster. It's still slower than that fast accompaniment. And those differing, repeating rhythmic patterns that accompany eventually come to the fore and begin to take over the music as it intensifies and begins to accelerate. Here we get. Remember, the music is in layers and they're not all moving in the same patterns. That's what creates a lot of the interest. And eventually those differing layers begin to come together and coalesce into this huge, unified climax that yields a very pounding figure. Let's hear the transition to that. Quite a dramatic climax, and it continues to cap not just the movement but the entire work, bringing it to a really intense high point. Gradually slows down as the movement ebbs away. Again, morphing without a seam into the fourth movement, which he calls a final shaking. And even though we return to the fast tempo of the opening, this final movement, at least it starts out almost like a memory rather than the actual joyous shake or dance. It begins with very high and almost ghostly figures that are quite soft. Just kind of floating. And soon he puts in some sustained notes. And then those other figures start to slide. Very high tessitura, we call it a range, and eventually we get this quivering of shakes, if you will, at different pitch levels that start to build the intensity of the movement. So let's hear where that comes. As we are on our journey now, again, some peaceful, slow and low tones enter, as if they're trying to calm down the upper level agitated figures. At first, they're not successful, but let's... It's almost like as the agitated figures grow, the low tones have to recede, but they don't give up, they come back. The rhythmic figures are still resisting, but eventually they yield. And the music finally begins to fade away. And the gentle dance finally ends. What a wonderful piece. I hope you get a chance to hear the whole thing. My name is Rose Breckenridge.